My Life as an Animal, Serialisation, Week 1. This episode is brought to you by animalaid.org.uk, who campaign peacefully against all forms of animal abuse and promote cruelty-free living.
It's now time for an audiobook here on UK Health Radio with My Life as an Animal, written by Andrew Tyler and read by Jim Smith.
My Life as an Animal, for Sarah. If all went to plan on April 28, 2017, I ended my life in a small village in the canton of Zurich, accompanied by officials from Dignitas. To remain within the law, I had to do the deed myself, lift the cup and drink a very large dose of sodium pentobarbital, together with an antiemetic to stop me vomiting it up. I first contacted Dignitas in October 2015, knowing what Parkinson's had in store, and then allowed myself plenty of time to consider whether and when to go ahead. The alternative, because of my condition, was to eke out more years without purpose. I wrote in my letter, without the work that means so very much to me, shrinking into pain, infirmity and indignity, I do not want that. I want to be free of that dread prospect. And it is the case that I had been finding it increasingly difficult simply to sit and type because my crumbling back caused me so much pain. Reading was also something I had to strictly limit, and for the same uncomfortable reason. For nearly 2 years I hadn't been able to do that simplest of things, sit up in bed with a book. In 2013, I had an MRI scan, and it showed the presence of severe degenerative disease, with almost complete loss of disc, space and disc bulges and dehydration over most of the lumbar discs. And things got worse. At the same time, I was finding it more of a trial to walk. There were periods of hours during most days when my legs wouldn't carry me. The problem with the back pain meant that a wheelchair was not the solution it might have been. Sitting made the pain worse. Strong drugs, I knew from recent experience, have a very limited effect in remedying such pain, and most of them leave you severely constipated, which of itself was a serious problem, not least for someone with Parkinson's. All kinds of weird things began happening simultaneously, with the increasing feeling of weakness and instability that are standard issue with Parkinson's. My hands, feet and ankles were swollen. My hands were extremely red and, in fact, turned the colour of blood-red oranges in the bath. Also, there was quite severe skin eruption on the outside of my hands. More seriously, 2 or 3 times a day, several fingers were drained of all colour and looked waxen yellow, signalling circulatory problems. In my last year, I had lost 1.5 stone and slept about 3 or 4 hours a night, but broken up into segments of 20, 30, 40 and 50 minutes, an hour if I was lucky. What I didn't want above all, and who does, was to slide into what ultimately awaits many Parkinson's patients, becoming a helpless, immobile, drooling shadow of what I was, unable to speak or think properly. So there we have it. Despite the negatives, those last months were very satisfying. Working on my book, taking stock of things, being content that I had a, hopefully, dignified way out. My October 2015 letter showed how clear my thinking was. In it, I say that the prospect of a Dignitas-assisted and doctor-supported death gives me great heart and a feeling of positivity. I've had a rich, varied and wonderful, fulfilling life. To be able to make choices about how it ends and exert a real measure of control would be wonderful. For a Peaceful World, Andrew Tyler. Prologue. These are just some thoughts starting, to my surprise, with the God of my childhood, a God I lost touch with many decades ago. I'm 70 now and physically ailing. But this isn't the story of somebody scrambling to embrace youthful certainties in the hope that it will pay off in that dark place beyond the grave. Rather, I'm thinking about the forces that control the way we think and the way we act. They leave us, it seems to me, fearful of trusting who we really are and fearful of daring to be that person. The God I grew up with is the God of the Old Testament. I was taught that he is a demanding, wrathful, and jealous God. Jealous in the sense that any thoughts we might have had of other gods were to be banished. We were forbidden even from speaking his name, or from making graven images which I took to be carvings of some sort. In case we elevated such objects to the status of God's surrogate, I doubt that such a thing would have crossed my mind, as it happens. But the message was understood. There is one God only. He's infinitely mysterious, powerful, and prescient, and he was watching everything I did. Years later, what should have long ago been obvious finally occurred to me. God did not create human beings in his own image. It was the other way round. In a narcissistic masterstroke, man created God as an almighty manifestation of his own ambitious self. He created a divine ogre, the ultimate disciplinarian who had lightning bolts streaking from his fingers and thunder in his unraked silver hair. This God was everywhere in the Jewish children's home I grew up in with 200 other kids. The God from our Hebrew lessons and prayers saw everything. He saw into our gloomy dormitories with their creaky iron beds and splintery wooden floors. He knew the huge cracked enamel baths, the little upstairs synagogue, where, locked in a glass-fronted cabinet, were half a dozen holy scrolls, sheathed in purple felt that was embossed with gold Hebrew lettering. And he knew the names and deeds of the philanthropists whose somber portraits hung, life-size, from the walls of the communal dining hall. This God was everywhere and saw everything. He perched invisibly, permanently on my shoulder, watching me, watching the world, and always ready with a rebuke. He had, in the idiom of later times, Silicon Valley vision and Pentagon firepower. I was a skinny, anxious boy with a lively repertoire of tics, jerks, blowing and sucking that I did my best to suppress. A lot of the kids in that home were orphans. Others, like me and my two brothers, were sent there because family life was fractured. Into the mix, in our case, went alcohol, violence, secret affairs, one or more secret abortions, mental breakdown, and finally the dispatch of we three boys to the South London orphanage. The place, the whole experience, was somehow exotic. I remember children from Hungary, Egypt, India, and Canada. There were blackberries and apples in the thorny, tangled perimeter where we played spies and assassins. We jumped off a fort parapet to prove that we weren't scared and exchanged love notes with the girls through impassive go-betweens. We ran, wrestled, climbed trees, and made camps in the wood. The flowers that still evoke those times are dandelions, buttercups, and daisies. The white, gold, and green. They were perfect creations of nature. Not loud and dazzling like flower show roses, but just as they should be. Later, I found out that these flowers I most admired were mere weeds. They were troublesome invaders that faced being uprooted or chemically poisoned on sight. But registering deeper than these spring and summer memories was the religious conditioning. It was there always in the prayers, the Bible history classes, the Hebrew lessons, and those Friday evening, Saturday morning, and Sunday afternoon synagogue services. They took you into an ancient world that was both lush and arid. Moses in the bulrushes, Jacob in the desert, God close at hand. He whispered into the ears of kings and prophets. Samson brought down the temple. Joseph had a coloured coat and he was his father's favourite. Battles were fought with terrible savagery. Years of plenty followed years of famine. The God of the Jews took his people to the edge of the abyss, but always pulled them back. Why could they not please their wrathful God, their jealous Father in heaven? All was passion and chaos in this ancient biblical world, and it lived on in the murmured prayers and cliffhanger tales that swirled around us in the children's home. The Start, or What My Mother Wanted. It was March 1967. I was aged 20 years and 6 months, and I was about to board a flight from London to Toronto that would at last set me free from the cloying grip of my mother. My troubled mother, the only child of Yiddish-speaking parents who were first cousins, and whose own parents had come over on the boat from Lithuania. My mother wanted something that was more richly coloured than they had. Not the stove, not the cut-price faded clothing from Petticoat Lane Market, or from Nathanson's second-hand clothes shop off Stoke Newington High Street that was still run by Nathanson himself. Mr. Nathanson shaped and pitched his patter, as though for wealthy ladies from a classy end of Paris. He would cite the season's new catwalk colours. He was an avid browser of second-hand Vogue magazines, as justification for charging an extra couple of pennies if you were buying, and giving you a couple of pennies less if you were selling. "A green like this," he'd say in a despairing voice, while holding to the light one of the old shirts my mother had bought in to barter. "Not this year. No one wants such a colour." My mother wanted a beautiful life in which everything was fashionable and beautiful and desired. The men, the clothes, the dancing and the kiss, the loving kiss. She wanted love. She went searching for it. And instead of finding the one who had it all, a dark-eyed, good-looking man who danced sublimely and oozed an obvious kind of charm, then she found out he had his own frailties. But she couldn't see that they were magnified by her endless need for reassurance, to hear from him minute by minute that he truly did love her. Yes, as much as the night we met. He went door to door, my father, and took money for adding splashes of colour to sepia-toned family photographs. Perhaps he had something of the artist about him. He played piano in rowdy pubs from Dalston to South Tottenham, which was a very un-Jewish thing to do in those days. And he and my mother, after the cuddling years were finished with, argued and shouted. He hit her and was instantly mortified by what he had done, but he hit her again and again. It continued until a February morning in 1949 when my grandfather, Pop, a quiet principled man, walked the 50 yards from his little Guinness Trust flat to the identical flat in which my mother lived. And when my father answered the doorbell, my grandfather bust open his lower lip with a punch that was much deferred, which had in it all the pent-up rage of a man who'd long been incensed but felt impotent to act over the bullying his daughter was taking. Within minutes, my father was driven out. Hard spirits, the alcoholic sort, claimed him within 9 or 10 years. They claimed first his vigour, then his bladder, then his sanity, then his liver, until nothing of him remained. I only hazily remember the day my older brother Nick and I finally left the Jewish orphanage, latterly the Norwood Home for Jewish Children. We had been there 8 years, and now we were to return to the Guinness Flats, where I would live with my mother, her new husband Joe, and my kid brother Mitch, while Nick would go back to live just yards away with our grandparents, Nan and Pop. If I'm to be honest, I do recall harbouring a shameful, petty resentment the day we left Norwood. If I could blush, I would do so as I recount it. Nick was 15, the official leaving age, and so he was given Norwood's deluxe leaving gift for grown-ups, a generous starter kit for the adult world. It included a lightweight greenish-brown checked topcoat, a narrow-lapelled blue suit, monogrammed handkerchiefs, a brown pair and a black pair of shoes, and, best of all, a marvellously impractical gentleman's shaving kit that was stowed away in a heavy zip-up brown leather holder. Among its unexpected parts were a silver hip flask and a retractable measuring tape. Being just 14, my own starter kit was a little Kodak camera and volume 1 of daily and occasional prayers, in both Hebrew and English. The book's handwritten inscription said it was because I had an aptitude in that direction. While I didn't anticipate that the final break from Norwood would be screamingly joyful, I didn't expect such a heavy gloom to settle over me as soon as I reached my new Guinness Flats home. My kid brother Mitch was full of happy tears, while Joe, still in his 20s, strode about, commandingly, telling my mother not to overexcite herself. She, meanwhile, was goading us into refilling our plates. "Here, have more. Have it. I bought it specially." More cake, more biscuits, another honeyed ham sandwich, another sliced orange. Over the following weeks and months, I felt increasingly trapped and smothered. After years of rarely seeing or hearing from her, my mother now had cautionary words for every aspect of my life. Girlfriends, the dance clubs I visited, and even the cut of my trousers. Of course, that's what a mother does. But with us, the connection was long ago broken, as much as I tried for her sake to pretend otherwise. It all made me thankful for my two brothers, for those little true moments that passed between us, the giggling fits included. I had left school and wanted not just work that was done in a half-slumber solely for a wage packet, but work that demanded everything of me. I wanted the sensation of total immersion, of being engrossed. I filed letters and cuttings and fetched tea and sandwiches for more than 2 years at the trade magazine called Draper and Fashion Weekly. Its editorial director, the excellent Mr. Stanley Mason, gave me the chance I craved by making me a junior reporter. And so it went on, work, parties, girls, dance clubs, getting stumbling drunk and dreams of escape. Curiously, though my mother had married a man who wasn't Jewish, and she hadn't seen much of her two older boys for half their childhood, she did take seriously what she claimed to be an absolute cultural obligation. This declared that Jewish boys and girls must not leave home before they are married. Otherwise, they signal a shameful failure of parenting. Several times my mother invoked this solemn rule, until I was convinced that the only break I could make, other than marriage, which wasn't remotely on the horizon, was a clean one stretching over thousands of miles. The planning was done in secret. My companions were 3 other young men, 2 of whom I knew from my trade magazine work, while the other was another old Norwood boy. My mother and Joe, though feeling hurt and rejected by my subterfuge, and also fearful of what lay in wait at the other side of the Atlantic, drove me to the airport and waved me off on my big adventure. No, let's be honest, we were on the road to Heathrow, and I had just finished telling them that they were to get it fixed in their heads that I was a competent and organised individual who was ready for this grand adventure, when I realised I'd left my passport in a fruit bowl in the front room. With good grace, Joe did the 2-way dash back to North London and the return to Heathrow. Then, as the stars came out and the jet whistled, howled and tucked in its wheels with a big shudder, we were on our way to Toronto.
UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good. UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good.
Oh, Canada. How easy it was to get things done in Toronto. There was none of the English pomp and rigmarole associated with finding somewhere to live, opening a bank account, or buying a car. We stayed in a cheap downtown hotel for a couple of days and then rented a place 10 miles north of the city on Yonge Street. It already felt like being in a movie, and even if things went badly wrong from now on, it wasn't going to hurt because it was written into the script. It was during the third evening in our Yonge Street apartment that things went wrong. We were eating an ox liver, onion and bacon stew. I now practically retch at the thought. When Mike told us that he didn't realise how great the pain of separation from his new girlfriend would be. He would have to go home to London. Mike had just given up his job on a menswear trade paper, and the girl he ached to be with he'd known for less than a month. On a practical level, our flat rental now had to be paid by 3 instead of 4. A week later, we lost one more, Richard, the ex-Norwood boy. I don't recall his reason for going, but his exit was accompanied by a series of urgent whispered phone calls. That left just Kit, an ambitious small ad salesman, who had infused me with his love of Irish traditional songs, which we play and sing together. He had deliberately left his guitar in London to keep it safe, while I wouldn't be parted from my bargain bin copy of a Gibson Hummingbird. Kit assured me he would stay, but because the 2 defections had ripped a hole in our already meagre resources, we quickly needed to start earning. There was a casual work agency called Manpower, which had something on offer most days. But it did mean standing in line in a downtown meeting point at something like 5:30 in the morning. This was still March, and a cold March early morning in Toronto could turn your fingers to stone and set your ears on fire if you didn't have the right gloves and pull-down headgear. We decided to keep the apartment going. I suspect Kit was getting money sent to him from home, and we swore to keep ourselves solvent, rather than become defeatist and dissolute before the adventure had even begun. Joining that queue of men who slapped their sides and stamped their feet to keep warm felt like being in a scene from On the Waterfront. The money wasn't good working through Manpower, but it was regular. Most of their jobs lasted a day and involved unloading or filling up a truck or stacking warehouse shelves using a forklift. I even delivered bohemian crystal glassware to a central downtown department store without dropping a single goblet. My standout assignment called for me to take a huge, unmanageable jug of weed killer and decant the contents into 2-pint cans, using a hopeless plastic funnel. I was at it for hours, with the stuff repeatedly splashing my hands and even dampening my trousers at around knee height. Was that the seeding of my Parkinson's, which I later linked to years of animal campaigning work? If it turned out that animal advocacy was what caused my physical ruin, I wouldn't have changed a thing. But I hated the thought of it being traced back to that dopey day when I was rinsing my hands in a toxic chemical. We were careless about such things back then, and careless too about brutal acts where animals were the victims. This was especially the case when Kit and I moved west to a logging town in British Columbia called Prince George, that was located in the geographic centre of the province. From here, the guys in the red and green block colour shirts drove out into the bush to hunt bears and moose. We never troubled ourselves to imagine what this hunting really meant. Then a hunter I subsequently worked with for a few days in a logging camp gave me an insight. He said that in the breeding season, he and a few friends would get a kick out of playing around with moose females, who were known to be fierce in defence of their newborn. By play, he meant they would go at her in numbers with rocks, sticks, whatever came to hand, so that, like a Spanish bull at the mercy of the toreador and his band of sadists, the moose wouldn't know which way to turn. I should have told the idiot thug what I thought of his cruel antics, but I probably didn't know what I thought. Much of the time I was floating above the action, pretending that these scenes from my big adventure were from a movie rather than my life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It was April 1967, and Kit and I were coming to the end of our first 2 months in Canada. All of it spent in Toronto. During the last days in the capital, I experienced something of an existential shock. We had been hired by a government agency that had a management role for Lake Ontario, one of the giant horseshoe pattern of lakes that, I read, were critical to the development of the social and economic wealth of North America's northeast. In April 1967, there was not yet a general understanding that the way we lived our lives, our reckless patterns of consumption, were killing the earth. That was despite evidence of the ruin being everywhere present, including at my own Toronto workplace. Each morning, I walked to the lake management office close to the city centre, where I did an unmemorable paper shuffling job. On arrival, I'd peer over the rails and see Ontario herself. I'd see there something terrible that I have never even spoken of in town, not in the press, on television, nowhere. What I saw each morning was a carpet of dead fish floating on the surface. Hundreds of them. Sitting at my office desk, I'd hear the percussive slap of their dead bodies against the man-made walls of the lake. And each day there were more dead. Prince George was more than 3,000 miles across country. It appealed to us not only because we were likely to find work there, but also because we were ready to get away from the have-a-nice-day American hamburger culture that was so dominant in Toronto. There was some of that in Prince George too. But drive 5 minutes out of town and it's a new planet, a planet of trees, for miles in every direction. There was more or less just trees. Kit pointed out to me birch, spruce, yellow cedar, Douglas fir and maple, and acknowledged others whose names he didn't know. The main commercial crops were spruce and birch varieties. This we discovered firsthand 7 or 8 days later, when the head of a little bush logging company came to our table in one of the big Prince George pubs and offered us 2 weeks' work at his camp 30 miles out of town. We were part of a 12-man crew that took a chainsaw to dozens of proud specimens over a few days. Kit was with the group that felled them, stripped off their branches and limbs, cut them into logs and dragged them back through a clearing to our little base camp. My job was to be the mug at the end of a jerry-built line with, I recall, circular saws of different sizes sunk into it. Logs were loaded at the end opposite to me, and the belt pulled them towards the saws, which stripped them of their bark, sliced them into planks, and delivered them to me at pace. I was to apply a deft touch of hand and wrist, both left and right simultaneously, and stack the planks neatly each side of me. After just 45 or 50 minutes of juggling those monstrous planks, I experienced such overwhelming exhaustion that I went into a otherworldly hallucinatory state. But I got through the first day, then the second, and we carried on, Kit and I, for the agreed 2 weeks, getting stronger all the while. But we never got the money promised. Our unlovely employer ignored all our pleadings, and when we went to his trailer just outside town to continue pressing our case, he jerked his head in the direction of a firearm on the wall. "You could do with some improvement with your staff relations," I said, or maybe I just said it in my head. Our next boss was more reasonable. He was a Prince George local who had started his own newspaper and magazine, as well as a mining and construction company. This was all before he was 23. He was probably a genius, but he drank too much, and when I arrived, it was rumoured that he was struggling to deal with the bitter fact of a young German visitor to the town who was giving his wife the sex she craved, although I've no idea how true that was. Rick put me in charge of most of his publishing assets after seeing evidence of my fairly precocious, though hardly dashing, journalism career in London. I'd wound up, aged 19, as deputy editor of a 2-man glossy monthly for the stationery and bookselling trades, though, in reality, the editor's appetite for drink meant his contribution was strictly limited. Rick made me editor of his magazine, also a photographer, sports writer and all-topics news reporter for the Weekly Recorder. My first photographic assignment was to get a shot of a triumphant local hardware store owner who had just returned from the bush with a trophy. There, laid out in the back of his pickup, his great head propped up by a stick wedged under his chin, was a once powerful brown bear, who the hardware store man had shot through the heart. The bear's eyes remained open, and while I imagined I might have seen reflected in them a premonitory look of terror, I saw nothing. They seemed drained of any trace of feeling. This was 10 years before I came to register and properly recognize the horrors to which we subject most animals on this planet. But even on that day in May 1967, I felt an unsettling melancholia to see the stricken, dishonored bear. Canada, I had hoped, would give me the confidence I lacked in London. It would open up my voice and even help me understand the person I was supposed to be. I understood that the 8 years in Norwood had conditioned me to be compliant and obedient to authority. But I calculated that this big new country offered the semi-anonymity that would allow the me that was really me to come to the surface. Peering into the eyes of the slain bear threw up all kinds of doubts. My mind was still churning when the stick wedged under the bear's chin spontaneously snapped and his head slipped down against the truck floor with a loud, fleshy thump. The hardware store man did a little involuntary step sideways and screeched, "You don't have to be scared of the bear anymore." I thought, "You killed him." Prince George certainly had a redneck let's go kill a bear streak in those days, but there was also plenty of open-minded locals and folk singing, poetry writing, transients and runaways who made the town a good place to be. At the Recorder there was a special camaraderie around the office, of the kind I've encountered only 2 or 3 times in my life. None of us wanted to go home at the end of a day's work. Well, maybe the spoken for, married ones did. The rest of us would hang around gossiping and laughing, playing guitar and eating steak and baked potatoes from the open all-hours restaurant on the ground floor. We liked each other, and we were proud of the newspaper and magazines we produced. We also liked the idea that the boss was so young. The lasting memory for me of our Canadian West Coast experience was not the crook who cheated us. It wasn't the strange pub culture that presumably, in the interest of preventing brawls, more or less dictated that you stay in your seat, except to fetch a fresh pitcher of beer from the bar or to empty your bladder. What stayed with me was seeing up close the haste with which Western Canada's marvellous wilderness was being plundered, and with me the accidental boy logger being drawn into being part of it. No less disturbing was witnessing wild animals being treated as a hostile alien force that had to be vanquished. We did all that in Europe, it has to be said, long before Canada got started, and I suspect we'd do it again given the opportunity. Kit and I decided it was time to move on, if only for a few weeks. So we set off on our journey to Mexico, stopping off in San Francisco for what should have been 2 or 3 hours to see the funny hippies we'd been reading about. Then it was to be back on the bus to Guadalajara, where we'd eat real tacos and fried beans. We made straight to Haight Street and trudged up and down like prurient tourists from the Midwest, looking for the big clue to explain the phenomenon. Practically everyone walking past smiled, looked straight at you and said, "Hey, man," or "How you doing, man?" I was curious. There were lots of questions about what people were doing here, who they were, what they believed in.
UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good. UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good.
San Francisco, summer of 1967. Escape from sanity. Kit stopped to take a look at the map he'd just bought at San Francisco bus station. It was important for him always to know precisely where he was, which suited me since I'm in the top league when it comes to going in the wrong direction. "If you're really lost, man," a lean blonde-haired youth said to Kit, "then that map ain't gonna get you there, if you dig." Kit gave him a bit of a look. "This is High Ashbury," I reminded Kit, when blonde hair had moved on. "That's how they talk here." Mostly I was seeing young, happy faces with scarcely anyone over the age of 40. At least 3 music tracks were playing simultaneously, from street level and above. The music was loud and formless, with guitars rushing up and down scales and drums doing their clattering best to keep up. Just ahead of us, a couple stopped and did a few seconds, Dre's bendy, swaying dance that I came to recognize as belonging to the San Francisco crowd. Kit and I were now staring through the open door of a shop specializing in posters. They were mostly a swirl of milky colors, pink, mauve, lilac, and baby blue. I could also see beads and incense and paraphernalia that looked like it came from a Shanghai opium den. On a table near the entrance were little silver-framed Edwardian prints. One was called Park Scenes, another was A Day at the Seaside, and there was a poignant tableau of a returning soldier called When Daddy Came Home. One of his eyes was bandaged, and he was leaning on a single crutch. Someone asked us if we wanted to score some weed, and someone else, less than 5 minutes later, if we had any to sell. The would-be buyer's shoeless feet were yellowy purple and horribly swollen. His long black hair tangled and matted, but he still wore a High Ashbury happy face. The hippie dress style, from what I'd so far seen, was anti-fashion. For males, beaten-up denim jeans and a too-big T-shirt that might advertise a local band. A lot of the young women favoured floaty cotton print dresses and went makeup-free. The early 60s bands back in England got us all used to longish hair, but not the length you saw it here, and never with zero consideration for any kind of style. It seems it was the uncouth hair of male hippies as much as any other of their weird ways that angered the reactionaries of America. On men, they believed long hair was deviant as well as defiant. It was proof of effeminacy, the mark of disrespectful fornicators who mocked everything of which a decent society is made. Not just decent, but resilient, able to defend its values through the agencies of law, order, and justice. And without those, where would they be, these people? Living in ditches and eating grass, which is probably their idea of perfect anyway. Or something like that, was how they saw it. Some years after my Haight Ashbury adventures, I stayed overnight in a Norfolk, Virginia hotel. The Bible I found in my bedside locker featured illustrations of Jesus and his disciples. They wore the familiar biblical robes and sandals, but the hair was short, greasy, and combed back like a 50s rock and roller. It was both funny and pitiful, this hopeless attempt to recast Jesus and his loyal band as good old boys from the South. The day Kit and I arrived in San Francisco, we knew nothing of this, nothing of who and what we were looking at, what sparked it and where it was all going. But I did know within 15 or 20 minutes that I wanted to spend time here. It wasn't an intellectual thing, but just the way the place looked, the benign chaos of it. I was sure that here I could submerge myself and be anything I wanted to be. It was the very formlessness, shapelessness of the place that was the appeal. This quality was evident even in the clattering music that boomed down the streets, and in those swirly, dreamy teardrop posters, and in the bendy way people danced. I would find out soon that it was also in the drugs that induced thoughts that melted and ran backwards. And I would find it in the most intimate aspects of people's lives. I said to Kit that I was intrigued by the place And rather than dashing off to catch the Greyhound to Mexico, how about staying overnight? The bus tickets were okay to use in the morning. He agreed, not because staying appealed to him, but because he decided I needed watching. At just turned 21 years old, I was 3 years younger than he was and had a propensity for being vacant and inattentive at times. In Toronto, a month after we'd landed, I'd left a canvas shoulder bag on a subway train. It contained about $35, some letters, a few notes to myself, and other stuff. I had fallen asleep, then awoke as though stabbed in the ribs when we got to my stop, and flew out of the carriage, leaving my bag on the seat. But here comes the dozy part. Lost property had my bag. I rushed over to pick it up, and on the way back to work, I again left it in a carriage. My cheeks burnt with shame. I didn't even try to reel it back in that second time. Kit said he'd stay for one night, but not in the Height District. This was despite a youth I'd been talking to called Jake, saying he knew a good place nearby to crash. It belonged to a middle-aged Florida woman, an opera singer who Jake said was unusually tolerant of humanity in all its guises. It was an attitude she developed after her brother came back from the war in Japan, with his face melted from burns and the skin on his back a cracked, bubbly mess. Jake said I was unlikely to see the brother, but Graveyard Jack would probably be there. Graveyard Jack was a fresh casualty of the Vietnam War. He'd been concussed by enemy fire and came to in a ditch only to find he'd been sleeping on a dead pal. He now kept reliving the horror in his sleep and sometimes woke up screaming and cursing. Kit booked a hotel downtown. I went to the house of the opera singer where, without incident, about 10 of us slept on the floor in one room beneath a heavy pall of cannabis smoke. I could see that if I was to stay in High-Ashbury, I would need a sleeping bag. The next morning, Kit returned to Prince George. He was no longer interested in the Mexico trip, and I began the first full day of my San Francisco adventure. For a couple of hours, I wandered up and down High Street and the streets that crossed it, peering through shop windows and sometimes going inside to look at the coloured bead necklaces and wristbands I'd seen the men wearing. In a shop at the end of the main Height drag, there was a collection of American Indian animal carvings, neatly set out on a cedarwood table. They were just a couple of inches long and made from rock in the main, though sometimes from shell or wood. A little printed card, propped up on a bison, said they were the work of Pueblo Indians. Indigenous American culture was evoked with great reverence by hippie entrepreneurs. At the Height music gigs I later went to, many of them free admission, the warm-ups might be a couple of guitar-thrashing local bands, but the bill topper could easily be one or more chanting, singing Native Americans. The nomenclature issue had become tricky. The Longhairs loved it, greeted them as messiahs, and beheld their instruments as though they were sacred relics. I remember drums, part filled with water, longish hardwood sticks that were rhythmically clacked together, and a 1 or 2 string fiddle whose body looked to be made from a big stalky plant. In the afternoon, I walked the short distance to Golden Gate Park, lay back on my elbows and lost myself in the rhythms being slapped out by a line of hand drum players, conga, bongos, doumbeks, joints were passed around, frisbees flung in the air. I closed my eyes and saw hippies swaying to the drum beats under a purpley mauve horizon. At last I felt I had landed in the city of St. Francis. The Francis, who was a 12th century friar and whose devotion to his God, history tells us, was expressed through his love for all creation. It is said he cared for the poor and sick. He preached sermons to animals and praised all creatures as brothers and sisters under God. Over the next 3 or 4 days, I put myself through a crash course in surviving High-Ashbury on dwindling finances. The modules included keeping yourself fed and your stuff safe, ensuring a place to bed down, knowing who to talk to and who to avoid, understanding drugs, the boosters and the wreckers, earning money without a work permit, and, this was the big one, what is it all about? The solution to a lot of it was the Diggers. They were the true heroes of High Ashbury's Summer of Love. The Diggers were a communal living anti-private property theatre group from San Francisco who echoed the English 17th century visionary egalitarians of the same name. The San Francisco Diggers began publishing political literature in 1966, and the following year in High Ashbury laid on free practically everything. This included a soup kitchen-style handout twice daily in the Golden Gate Park and a drop-in health centre established with a group of young doctors. The maladies that kept on coming for treatment were bad feet, drug-induced bad trips, and sexually transmitted diseases. But even with the Diggers, you could still go hungry or find yourself in the dead of night being emptied into the street from a warm room because someone came home and wanted to reclaim his bedroom from 7 or 8 hippies who thought their invitation extended to the morning. And while I recall going to a Diggers shelter in Los Angeles, I don't remember them being in any other American town or city. But wherever I found myself and however unpromising the food and night shelter situation was, I tried to resist getting into a frenzy, but instead trust to luck and remind myself that, being dependent on others' generosity, it was essential to avoid the look of the desperate man on the make. That man is rarely well received. Besides, I could find a park to sleep in during the day, and food would somehow turn up. In those early months, long hairs were generous with each other. They'd share what they had. I was the same when I had money, obtained from distributing music gig flyers, looking after a shop, doing some cleaning, running an errand, that kind of thing. Faces came and went like ghosts that summer and into 1968. It would happen with a new friend with whom you conversed so animatedly through much of the night about New Age stuff, love, ego, truth, and death. You had started the evening in a Hike coffee shop and played a game or two of Go, the mind-bending Chinese ball game that had High Ashbury entranced, and you decided to hitch a ride together in the morning to San Diego. Someone had told you the chances of getting unregistered work there were good. So we're standing on the freeway on ramp with our thumbs out, when one of us, yes, it was me, suddenly decides to switch directions, and we each rapidly dissolve from one another's lives. Where would I have gone to instead of San Diego, which I later found to be an unfriendly naval town? Maybe to Portland, Oregon, or Springfield, Illinois, or Vancouver, or Memphis, Albany, New York, Vancouver Island, Indianapolis, New York City, Detroit, Cincinnati, Los Angeles, San Bernardino, New Orleans, San Jose, these being some of the places I stopped off at during my North American travels, sometimes for a few hours, other times for weeks. The San Diego business is an example of the new non-rules we hippies were working to, the rule-less, ego-less world that was so enticing, but also capricious and hurtful. The etiquette of how to avoid inflicting clumsy emotional wounds on each other hadn't been worked out yet. We knew, though, that straight culture was false and morally corrupt. But I must now stop using the term hippie. The word, I read, was a tabloid invention. It was a trash word. The term, preferred by many living in the High Street area in those days, was head. Probably because the head is the part of the human anatomy where the experiment in new living comes from and was most acutely felt. As to the big question, what was it all about? Here is a simple answer. It is wanting a world that counts love and peace as the highest ideals. A world in which all people show respect for the earth that nourishes them, and where they live simply, without the hoarding and worship of material things. Today, I'd want animals included as beings who warrant respect and justice. I remember talking about this high-minded formulation for hours with an old beatnik type from Cincinnati. Was it naive and dumb to say you believe in such things? We believed it was not. Our boudoir, shared with his kid brother and his brother's girlfriend, was the stone floor of a garage. The girlfriend knew the owner of the house, who not only gave us this hard, cold place in which to sleep, but also made a present of 3 or 4 blankets and some unpleasant-looking rags for sharing between us. The next day, the fleas bit and bit again and wouldn't stop. It was Gina, a woman who turned out to be critical to my education about the world, who came to my rescue. I met her husband David first. He asked me if I could break a $5 bill for him since he wanted some dollar coins. I said I couldn't. He asked if I'd heard about some bad acid that was around, which got us onto Thai sticks. Then how uncool it was to drink beer until you vomited. He asked what that accent of mine was. It amused him to meet a in-the-flesh Englishman. He knew of no others in the Height area that summer, and I didn't run into any either. He'd been there for 14 months with his wife. They had a pretty cool house, which they shared with Gina's older sister. He said I should come back with him and we could jam. Me on my jumbo acoustic, he on his congas. Gina waved hello to me as I followed David to a room at the back. She stood at the doorway and asked for a word with him. When he returned, it was with the suggestion that I take advantage of their bathroom and have a warm soak. My clothes were in her washing machine when I'd finished bathing, and a clean dark blue shirt and fresh jeans awaited me. They belonged to David, who swore he was happy to see me in them.